When the pavement gives up and the last painted line dissolves into dust, you cross a threshold the map never names. The road becomes something that listens. Trees press close, the telephone poles go sparse, and a porch light is the only square of civilization someone, something can measure. Tonight I'll take you down 9 of those roads. 9 accounts locals and witnesses have passed along. Stories compiled from interviews, neighborly warnings, and small newspaper clippings. Names and exact places have been changed to protect people who are still waiting for answers. What follows is reported by those who lived through it, described here with the care their testimony deserves. There is a different weather in Hollers. It hangs like a second sky, heavy with leaves and memory. Sounds travel farther there, a boot on gravel, an old dog's breath, the way wind finds a loose window. Listen close, and you'll hear a pattern. Some evenings you hear nothing, only the distant hum of a generator and the river's indifferent rush. Other nights, the night has a rhythm, and once you've learned that rhythm, you don't quite forget it. You can't unhear the pacing. Logan grew up where the road stopped being more than 2 ruts and a forgotten mailbox. His childhood trailer sat on a low rise that let you see the ridgeline like the back of a sleeping beast. We were the last place before nothing, he told me, voice even when memory tightened. His father worked nights, and his mother kept long hours at a gas station in the nearest town. Logan learned early what it meant to be alone with the wood smoke and the generator's steady thrum. Ordinary things anchored him: a dent in the kitchen table where a pocket knife had slipped, a plastic cup with a permanent ring from his favorite soda, the porch light that cast a small orange pool onto gravel and concrete steps. That light was the only arithmetic the night knew. Inside it was human, outside it was not. On Friday nights, when the trailer's radio played country stations and the lake of stars above felt close enough to touch, something began pacing. At first, it was slate gravel being shifted by a boot. That could be a neighbor. Then it was the interval, measured and patient, like someone keeping time with a metronome. The steps would stop at the edge of the light. Logan could smell wet leaves and something older below that smell, earth that had been turned, not by animals but by a deliberate foot. He'd watch from the window, and the thing, call it a shape because that was all it ever was, would pause in the darkness, just where the bulb no longer reached. They never came closer than that light, Logan said. They sat there. Sometimes they'd walk in a circle, just pacing in the dark, right where the dirt stops and the shine starts. Neighbors checked. A truck from down the road would slow, and a man would ask if everything was all right.
Deputies noted prints in the mud, elongated, oddly spaced impressions that did not match the tread of any boot Logan had ever seen. They were there at dawn, when the yard was gray with fog. Pairs of tracks in neat intervals, the impressions deeper at the pauses, as if someone had leaned, weight held on one leg. There were nights the sound stopped abruptly. No footsteps, no rustle, only to begin again on the other side of the trailer, pacing the perimeter as carefully as if it were counting rooms. Once, during a thunderstorm, lightning split the sky, and for a fraction of a second it was all revealed. A tall figure leaning against the wooden post of the porch, head cocked so that the silhouette seemed wrong. Too long, angles not quite human. Logan remembers the way his chest went tight, how his breath fogged the glass, even though the windows leaked heat. The figure did not move during the flash. When the thunder rolled and the light went out, nothing remained but the taste of copper and the freshly pressed mud. The deputies took statements. The sheriff came out with a flashlight that threw hard white lines into the trees. He said the prints didn't match anything in their database, but he also said there are always explanations in the daylight. That didn't make Logan, or the neighbor's wife who had watched from behind curtains, feel any better. The pacing kept happening for weeks. Sometimes it returned after Logan's parents left town for a visit. Then it would circle slower, as if listening for a different rhythm. Finally, the family left. Not overnight, but in little steps. The trailer was sold, the porch light stopped, the mail rerouted. Logan took only what would fit into a truck bed and a duffel. He took a night flashlight and a baseball glove, and the imprint of those pauses in the mud saved in his head. He says the sound has followed him in memory. Late at night in apartments near the city, he can still hear that metronome. Only now it's in the hum between subway stops or the click of a neighbor's shoes. You can't make it go away, he told me. It moves with you, I guess, like it learns the sound you've got. According to neighbors and the deputy's brief report, no conclusive evidence was ever recovered to explain the impressions. The pacing stopped once the trailer emptied, according to what people remember. But the image of that wrong silhouette leaning on the post is something Logan keeps like a photograph he never wants to look at, even though he does. If this is finding its way to you in the dark, if the idea of something patient on the edge of a porch makes your skin crawl, then stay with the stories. If you enjoy true, carefully sourced accounts of Backroads oddities, subscribe for more documented reports. I'm not asking you to go look. I'm asking you to listen. A dozen miles away, on a narrow ridge with a creek that still remembered the miners who had once pushed the land into submission, Sophie tried to buy quiet. She'd come from the city because she wanted to write, because the noise of traffic was a kind of cage. The cabin she rented was meant to be a small mercy, a wood stove, a bookshelf, a place where the only interruptions would be rain and the occasional truck rolling through on purpose. Locals like to remind outsiders that quiet is a different creature there. More than silence, it is a shape that waits for an invitation. She found comfort in domestic rituals, a kettle that took 10 minutes to boil over the stove, a small hand pump for water that needed a particular rhythm to wake. In the evenings she brewed coffee and read until the black outside the windows looked like velvet folded over the land. It was in those long, late hours that the tapping started. At first it was on the outer wall, a soft, measured knock, as patient as a watchmaker. One tap, a small pause. 2 taps, a longer pause. Sophie thought deer, a branch snagging wire. She taped a note to the door and sat with a cup and tea. The tapping came again at 2 in the morning, steady and a little closer. She thought of coyotes, of kids playing around, until she found herself measuring her own pulse against the sound. It started matching me, she said, and the way her hands found the table made it plain she still felt the alignment. Not just a rhythm, my heartbeat. If I put 2 fingers to my wrist, it would be there, right after, like the house was answering. She tested it. She would lie perfectly still, and then, when her heart slowed, the taps would too. When she walked across the floor, they would shift to another wall, as if following the line of her steps. Once she left cigarette smoke on the porch at dawn, the tapping came at the exact spot she'd been sitting, right beneath where her feet had rested. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the ears. She recorded it on her phone, a short clip she would later play back in the city, and find herself ashamed at how her fingers trembled at the file's playback. Neighbors who heard about it shared different folk remedies. Never let them pick up your name, an elderly woman said when Sophie asked what to do when the tap seemed to know where she slept. Don't answer, leave a light on, put salt across the threshold. The remedies felt like small armor, and Sophie tried them all. She left the porch lamp burning. She smeared table salt at each door. She refused to say the word hello if she thought anyone might be listening. At night the house settled and the taps would pause, but they always came back. Once she opened a cupboard and found muddy prints on the shelf edge, small, narrow, not like any boot she recognized. A local handyman checked the cabin, pried panels, checked the crawlspace. He found nothing but old nail holes and an old raccoon's nest. There are rational things. There are less rational things. Sophie kept asking herself which one had made those sounds. She lasted 3 months. On the last night, the taps stopped matching the rhythm of her chest and began to fall between beats, slightly quicker. It was as if whatever had been counting her decided it could do better on its own. She packed what she could and left before dawn, leaving the lights on because some part of her couldn't turn them off. Years later, in a crowded office with fluorescent lights and the city breathing through vents, she still hears the taps in the office's hum. She says it sits behind her sternum on bad days, an answer waiting to be echoed. Local accounts say that other tenants of that cabin reported the same, sometimes as a persistent knock, sometimes as something that circled the foundation for a few nights and then vanished. No physical intruder was ever found, and the cabin stands empty more often than not. The county inspector's notes mention no signs of break-in and leave the rest in the category of unexplained. If you imagine hands tapping in the dark to the rhythm of your heart, if that sound presses against your ribs, then you know how private terror feels. It is a sound that knows the cadence of your life and chooses to mimic it. The ridge between 2 hollers has reputations like old scars. Men there do not speak of it lightly. It was where Mason and Ray went one autumn, the kind of trip that is supposed to be small rites. A father and son, a friend, a chance to teach a boy how to read the weather in the land. Mason had been taught to respect the ridge, the way fog plugs a hollow and turns everything into a watercolor. So when Ray, the family friend, offered to walk a quieter line to glass for turkeys, they split up only because they trusted the ground and each other. They made the kind of camp that smells like coffee and gun oil. There was a thermos and a pack with a flannel folded across it. The hunt started like any other, a call that muffled under leaves, the snap of a twig. Mason fired once in the distance, he says,
a noise that made his ears ring. Ray answered by shouting, a habit he'd learned when the woods confused daylight. There was a lull, then silence so complete it felt deliberate. When Mason walked the route where he'd last seen his friend, he found the gun propped against a tree. It was set down upright, the stock buried a half-inch in moss. There were fresh dew marks on the barrel and a single glove folded on a nearby rock. No blood, no drag marks. It was as if Ray had paused, diffused something by setting the weapon down, and then walked away. Family members say they saw the tremor across Mason's face when he described the scene to deputies, the way the light and the low sun sharpened the edges of things. The search covered the ridge for days. Hikers, hunters, a short-lived volunteer posse, folk with lanterns and cell phones with weak reception, swept the contours of the land, calling names until voices leaked raw. Dogs scented and then lost the trail.
The ridge had gullies that swallowed sound and grass that closed like eyelids. Deputies marked the spot and left flyers. The local paper ran an account that treated it as a standard missing persons case. Last seen, family concerned, search ongoing. Over time, the area collected folklore. The ridge takes what it wants. Not because the land has teeth, but because small absences become explanations when no other holds. There are practical theories that people offer in the light of day: an animal attack, a fall into a hidden sinkhole, poor medical weather conditions that left a man unable to call for help. There are also stories that say the ridge is picky. It will accept only certain kinds of people or certain kinds of missteps. Mason and his family stopped going to that section of the forest. Hunters shifted their routes. A few older men started telling tales at the bar about paying attention to the breaks in fog. The community response was quiet, not sensational. Prayer circles and a memorial cross nailed to a tree on the road. Months later, someone reported seeing a pack that wasn't quite right near a drainage culvert. It contained personal items: an old thermos, a flannel with a knocked-out button, a glove that could have matched the one folded on that rock. The items were not linked by hard evidence to Ray. The family, of course, would not say more than it felt like closure, and it wasn't. Officially, the missing persons case remains open. Unofficially, the ridge has a reputation that changes the map for anyone who grew up there. There are lines you don't cross because the land keeps account, and the accounts are hard to argue with. Across a 2-lane road in a diner that refused to close, Ava worked the graveyard shift. Diners have a way of collecting people who are in transit: truckers, late shift nurses, the man who sleeps in his car because rent is due. Ava had learned to see the ordinary as a kind of camouflage. People come in ordinary forms. Some are just tired. A few, if you watch their hands and see how their eyes refuse direct contact, carry things you do not want to ask about. In the early mornings, there was a man who came in the same jeans and a coat that had seen better winters. He ordered the same coffee and sat at the counter, always at the far left corner where the window fogged from breath on cold mornings. He was polite, he was punctual, he tipped in small change. He did not speak to Ava beyond what was necessary. That was the thing that kept pulling her attention, his ordinariness. When a woman from the next town went missing, Ava read the flyer hung at the front door and looked at the man's hands. Later, when the missing person bulletin turned from a flap of paper into a small paragraph on the local news, deputies began rounding up interviews. The man at the diner began to draw attention in the neighborhood. Someone had seen him outside a gas station on a night when an out-of-town woman had been reported to have last been seen getting into a vehicle, they said. Ava described his eyes. She gave the deputies a description and said, "He made me feel like everything was normal enough to let your guard down." According to news reports and what deputies told a local reporter, a person matching that description was later questioned, detained for a short time, and then released when there was no immediate cause to hold him. Ava was told, privately, that he was a person of interest in initial inquiries. She recalls the deputies' faces being more tired than angry, a look of carrying the workload of small communities where a lot of bad things get called in late and there are never enough hands to follow them all. The terror here is in the ordinariness, the idea that someone who can sit and watch, who tips his hat politely and keeps his voice low, can be the difference between a missing woman and a missing person who no one remembers until the paper mentions her. Ava quit the graveyard shift. She kept the little habit of wiping the counter 3 times before she left, as if cleanliness could tighten the boundary between the safe light and the rest of the road. People in town began to lock their doors earlier. The diner put up a laminated sheet of community notices with a larger print missing persons section. The man, in the end, was never publicly named as guilty of anything in the county's reporting. Deputies did say the man fit many of the sightings the family reported, but the case moved slowly, a thing that threads in and out of public attention like smoke. Stories like that pass slowly through a community, quietly, without the sensational headlines.
They change where people walk and what they teach their children. The diner kept serving coffee. The man kept coming for a while, or someone who looked like him did, and then he stopped. Ava says that for months she couldn't bring herself to sit at the far left corner where the window fogged. It felt like admitting the ordinary is dangerous. Another hollow shares a similar patience, but it keeps its own count. The gate there is a wooden thing, sun-bleached, with a rusted chain that clinks like loose teeth when the wind rolls through. Locals don't go past the gate without a reason. The story begins with a pickup truck found on the shoulder, lights still on, ignition key in the dash, the driver's seat warm as if the driver had only stepped out a minute ago. The passenger door was closed. No body, no sign of the person. A pack lay by the gate, straps neat, a thermos dented where you'd expect a long trip to wear metal down. The first time this happened, the family built a small shrine by the gate. A cross, a laminated photo, a rock with the person's initials painted in white. Those things were meant to be small anchors for grieving.
They also became warnings. Do not go past the gate at night. Do not drink with friends at that pull-off. Leave a light on in the cab of your truck if you must pull over. They say the hollow keeps account. Packs reappear on the shoulder near the gate, sometimes with contents rifled through, sometimes neatly set, as if left there to be collected later. People come back with stories. One man wandered out at dawn and stumbled back down the road with leaves in his hair and mud on his knees, staring at the chain like he couldn't remember why his own hands were shaking. He told a neighbor he had gone after a sound and could not recall more than the sound itself, like a song that says nothing but hooks you until you don't know who you are. Searches have been launched. Deputies put up cautionary signs for a few months after each discovery. Folks started to teach younger ones a rule. When you pass the gate, count your people before you go in, and count them again when you come out. It sounds like common sense, but the hollers have their own logic, and counting doesn't always mean the hollow will accept that arithmetic. The gate remains, and the chain clinks, and other drivers glance at it as if measuring their own stopping points. The hollow collects stories. The family shrines spread along the roadside like short, private liturgies. Someone painted initials on rocks, another tied a faded scarf. The sheriff's office compresses what it can into forms and case numbers. The rest is small talk at the gas station and prayers at kitchen tables. Where there is no body, there is not closure, only an altered route home, and the knowledge that a boundary, visible, simple, now stands guard over memory. If you have driven such a road, you understand how quickly an ordinary mile becomes a place that demands rituals. You lock your truck door because the hollow listens. You are taught to leave the lights on because the light may be a limit. You learn the lesson quietly, as if the lesson itself were contagious. We end this section where the road folds into the woods. The stories I've told so far share a shape. Ordinary lives punctured by sounds and absences, traces that seem like answers. Prints, a rifle left upright, a pack on the shoulder, and then a hole in the record that no official form can completely fill. People change. They leave trailers, they stop sleeping in cabins, they put up crosses, and they whispered rules into the ear of a child who is still too young to know why they must heed them. There are more of these places. In every hollow, people have forms of memory. Sometimes it's a row of small wooden crosses by a creek. Sometimes it's a diner waitress who can't forget the polite man in the corner. The mountain keeps its ledger in a way that is quiet and terrible. It is not a roar, but a patience that makes a rhythm with your life, and then stops answering. The rest of the stories pick up the pattern and twist it. A call from a ridge that says your name, a house that appears for the lost, a curve where the road behaves like a living thing. They are linked less by cause than by the geography's power to insist on itself. But for now, know this. Once you have heard the story of a porch light and its patient steps, once you've sat with the idea of taps that count your heart, once you've pictured a rifle propped and a trail that ends, those images stack and layer and make the dark heavier. They prepare you for the next tales, where the listening becomes more intimate and the places themselves seem to rearrange to keep secrets. In a hollow named for an old mine, teenagers from town used to dare each other to find the house no map shows. Teenagers are certain of courage. They are also precise observers of wrongness. On a high bench of stripped earth where miners had pushed the hillside flat, a house sometimes sits that should not be there, square windows catching a sun that shouldn't touch it, a table laid out with plates and forks that gleam like unused teeth. You drive past and it isn't there. You park and walk in, and it is as if someone has just set down their cup and stepped out for a moment. Leo and his friends found such a place on a day when the sun was a hard coin.
They told me about the smell first, something like fresh bread, and something older, like someone had swept but left the floor warm from someone's feet. The table had a plate set, the napkin folded with careful hands. No dust, no footprints leading in. Leo said later he felt both relieved and watched, like coming upon an open umbrella and knowing that bringing it along would change the day. The teenagers sat for a while, daring each other to touch the utensils. They left one empty bottle on the porch as proof, a slide of evidence that they had been there. An older neighbor, Tom, swore he remembered a story his grandmother used to tell. Some houses show up for people who are lost, a place that offers the wrong kind of hospitality. People who accept everything it offers sometimes do not come back the way they were. When a landslide years after that clipped the bench where the house had been seen, the area changed. The road below filled with new gravel, and a scar like a healing bruise marked the slope. Local men pointed and said that used to be where the house stood. No address, no history, and the earth had closed like a mouth. The teenagers grew up and left town. One of them still dreams of the table. Another claims to have seen the house out of the corner of his eye on a rainy day when the light was wrong. There are explanations that talk about mirages, heat and light playing tricks on a mind hungry for shelter. There are also practical warnings that the land itself sometimes looks like it can be coaxed into being a shelter for people who have nothing.
The house is a reminder of choice. Sometimes a refuge is exactly what you need. Sometimes it is a place that will not let you return the same. If you were listening, you might feel the pattern settling like cold on your skin, the sound of steps, the answer of taps, a gun left without a body, a polite man with nothing in his hands, a gate that saves some and takes others by forgetting. These are places that change how people move and how they speak to their children about the night. The creek downriver carries its own memorials, neat little crosses tacked to roots and rocks, some weathered to silver, some fresh with paint. Chloe, who moved back to care for her aging father, found them on a walk with her dog and almost stepped on one. She stopped and started collecting names, initials, dates scratched roughly into the wood. She began to look up old clippings in the library, and one by one the names lined up with reports of missing people, sometimes with notes that suggested a route through backroads and tracks used to move things unnoticed. Neighbors told her what they had always known and did not always say, that the creek has been used for decades as a marker, a place to leave things, a place where people watch and sometimes watch away. There are rumors in small towns that are too serious to repeat without caution, the kind that pull in words like trafficking and routes and meetings in late hours. Chloe did not want to write those words without evidence. She kept the crosses in a row, each one a small accusation of absence and a record of memory. People added names to them. Some came with flowers, others with nothing but a prayer. The county archives show patterns that make you sit down, missing person reports that trace a line across certain dates, a cluster near the creek, a few that end with investigation ongoing, and then settle into a shelf of cold files. Deputies who took statements at the time and later were interviewed in pieces say investigators followed leads as they could, but the roads in that area are long and sparse, and the manpower is always thin. Search efforts were launched, volunteers walked the creek banks, and families waited, which is the terrible sticking place, the waiting. Chloe has become something of a steward for the crosses. She maintains a small notebook where she writes names and dates and notes of who visited. She is clear-eyed about the limitations of what anyone can do. We mark, she told me, so the place remembers. The crosses are less about finding answers than about refusing to be erased. Not every story ends with a name found. Some end with a line of initials marked on a damp piece of wood, and a community lowered into a small, steady state of vigilance. The creek does not judge. It carries things downstream and sometimes keeps them close to shore where only those who know to look will see. The memorials are weather, ritual, and protest folded together.
There are more roads to travel, more gates, more curves, more hollers that keep count. Each one adds a different fear to the ledger, a different way the land reaches into a life. The remaining stories are braided with the same threads. A scream that knows the sound of a child's name, a curve where headlights find something that is almost human, a hollow that collects the lost and returns others altered. They are stories that show how geography can be a character itself, shaping what happens at night and how people respond. So when you close your eyes tonight, do not imagine only monsters. Think of the quiet shapes that wear the cloth of ordinary life, the polite diner patron, the worn porch light, the house that offers a set table, and how those things can become thresholds. Remember that these accounts come from people who still live with the not knowing. They are reported by residents, remembered by family, and recorded in the odd little ways a community keeps watch. We have not yet moved past the middle of the road. There are more tales. There are names that trail like fingers on a map. The next ones bring the uncanny closer, a scream that pulls a name from the dark, a house that appears for those who are already lost, and a curve where drivers lose the shape of what they know. Each story bends a little more toward the idea that you cannot simply leave the night at the edge of your headlights and expect to be safe. Hear the rustle of leaves, the low drones of insects, the distant sound of a chain clinking on a gate. Keep them in mind as we go on. Once you have heard these backroads, they live in the small places of your life. The half-sleep, the moment your foot finds the edge of the bed, the thought you get just before you turn off a porch light. You cannot unhear them. They have a way of following you into places that seemed secure. And so, farther down the road, there is a place where a child's name cut across the dark like a blade. That story begins with a night watch, a parent's slow guilt, and the howl that answered in the valley. It is there, waiting, and it tells more than one kind of listener to beware. It is there, waiting, the sound of a name cut across the dark like something sharp. The night in that hollow holds its breath when it happens. People who have heard it say the muscles around the mouth tighten as if in mourning. Grace grew up with cattle and the lull of diesel trucks on a county road. Eli was a cousin who stayed around longer than most. He mowed as if the land would accept the neat lines and forget its own history. On a late summer night they were home alone. The adults were at church, and the lanterns on the porch had been left to gutter with moths. Ordinary things make the horror more effective. A folding fan that clicked when it caught a draft, the tin of biscuits that his grandmother kept under a towel, the porch light swinging faintly and painting the gravel in a square of comfort.
Grace and Eli were shelling peas and talking about nothing that matters later. What teacher was coming back next year, whose truck needed fixing. The valley was warm. The crickets were a steady ocean. Then a sound broke the pattern. A long, keening howl from the ridge, the sort of unhuman scream that seems to be half animal and half broken radio. It wasn't the high, bright scream of a fox. It had depth. What made them both freezer still, the thing that stamped itself into memory, was the next sound that threaded into it, a voice shaped into a name, not a scream at a distance, but a deliberate, spaced voice saying, Eli, drawing out the syllables as if testing whether that particular cadence belonged to a living thing. They called his name, Grace told me, wrapping her hands around a memory like a rag. It wasn't wind. It was like someone up there had stolen bits of us and was putting them back together to see if they fit. Neighbors later said people in the valley have always treated name calls differently. If something learns the sound you answer with, an old woman who'd lived there since before the strip mine was fenced off said, it starts to own a piece of you. You don't let them take that. You don't hand them your name. That night they barred the door. They locked every bolt and pushed a dining chair under the knob, because ritual sometimes feels like control. The scream came again, closer, like an echo that had narrowed. It stretched out across the pasture and settled into something almost conversational, testing vowels, finding habit in the children's names. Grace remembers Eli's face when he heard it again, his jaw clenched as if to stop a reflex to answer. Eli later said he wanted to shout back, the way someone might throw a stone to see the shade it makes, but he didn't. He had been taught to stay inside by a grandmother who remembered worse nights than this one. They say the scream takes what you give it. If you answer, you map yourself to it. The family called a neighbor on the radio who came with a lantern. They walked a ridgeline with a toothpick of light and called names out into the dark until their voices were small and hoarse. Dogs that modern people think we keep as furniture reeled and tugged for the leash. Older dogs that had been born in hollers and known storms sat and whined into the valley. Deputies came the next morning to take a statement, to shine lights into the trees where the sound had come from. They found nothing but flattened grass and the odd feather or two, no prints that proved anything beyond somebody had paced there the night before. Radio chatter later in town suggested it might be teenagers, a prank, an owl. Others said there are cries that are older than people and sound like someone remembering a name they once needed. In the months that followed, the family rearranged some domestic rituals.
Eli stopped sleeping with his window open and began to wear a coin tied to his socks because his grandmother said it would confuse names that wanted to take him. He learned to call himself by a different nickname when they had to say his name out loud, as if withholding the true syllable might sluice off attention. Grace still hears the long calling sound sometimes when the wind lines up with the hollow. "It makes you count the people in the house," she said. "It makes you keep a list in your head." Neighbors added extra locks. People who had once considered the night a neutral partner now treated it like a ledger. Names add up. So do the times you go out alone. The sheriff's office filed a report that read like many reports do. An event recorded, no apparent cause, no suspects identified. For Grace and Eli, there was no neat explanation. There was only a sound that knew a name, and the communal rules they learned afterward. The scream did not take someone that night. It took something simpler: ease. Not every encounter with the backroads ends with a voice or a footprint. Some of them close in around the senses, like a pressure band across your skin. Maya's account comes from the margin, where a shelf road clings to a cliff, and the lights of a highway look like a fallen galaxy below. The curve there has a name few locals use in front of visitors: Dead Man's Curve, and for as long as cars have worn the asphalt, it's had its toll. People leave flowers and reflector strips on those ribbons of guardrail where drivers misjudged the edge. Maya and her boyfriend were coming back from a show in a town that felt younger than their small valley. The night was clear, a skittering of stars bleeding cold through their windshield. She remembered the hum of the car and the way the radio cut in and out as they rounded the bends. There had been talk earlier about a rumor. An old man at the stop had sworn he'd seen something step into the road and then blink out, but Maya thought little of roadside rumors until it happened to them. Headlights picked it up first, a shape in the road that didn't belong. It stepped into the beam like someone choosing to be seen. It was humanoidal at a glance, 2 long limbs, the hint of a torso, but the joints were wrong. The shoulders seemed too high, the head too narrow. For a breath, they thought they were looking at a person. Maya swore later the thing turned and looked at them, not with eyes so much as with the suggestion of a face. Her boyfriend jerked the wheel. Gravel screamed. The car came within inches of the guardrail, and for a strip of time that felt too long, they watched the figure step aside, as if sinking away into the margin between road and cliff. When the headlights swept the spot again, there was nothing but a smear of wet leaves and a brightness on the asphalt that looked like oil but wasn't. They pulled over at the next turnout, hands that wouldn't stop shaking, keys still in the ignition, the engine ticking.
Maya touched the hood as if to make sure it was still solid. It was like it knew exactly when we would see it, she told me, like it timed itself to the light. At the curve, there was evidence that didn't explain itself neatly. The guardrail had new scratches not there before, and someone, either in the confusion or in a later check, found a pair of gloves tucked into a bush, knuckles fresher than the season. A driver coming the other way reported later that he had found his keys left in the ignition when he came back to his idling car. Another had woken in the morning to find a cigarette butt they'd sworn they didn't smoke. Town gossip made more of the story than facts could support. Some drivers swore they had seen human silhouettes vanish as if the road swallowed them. An older deputy, who had driven the curve before turnpikes and education campaigns smoothed things out, said privately that he'd seen everything from headlights playing tricks to people stepping out in desperation. Sometimes folks walk, he said. Sometimes the eye plays the hell out of you when you're tired. The county eventually added reflectors and rerouted the curve slightly, but locals still drive it as if sneaking, and many prefer the longer way home if they can avoid the shelf road at night. Maya stopped taking that road at sunset. There is a small way communities enforce safety that isn't municipal. People talk to each other, and the story instructs behavior. The city friends who used to visit bring their headlights to the long way round. Some locals say the curve has always been wrong. Some say the road keeps adjusting to take what it wants. Whether it is a trick of light and shadow, human misperception, or something that shapes itself at the edge of the beam, the curve altered the town's map of safe distances. It left people who'd seen too much with a private memory of a thing that moved almost human and was not. There is a braided logic in all these accounts, the ordinary pierced by an awkwardness that refuses a neat daylight explanation. A polite man in a diner, a rifle propped against a tree, a set table on a bench of mine waste, a line of crosses by a creek, a gate that collects packs. None of these are evidence of the supernatural by themselves. Each is a prism through which community memory leaks. Each is reported by someone who had to live with the not knowing. I went back to some towns months after I first spoke to people. You notice small things when you return. Curtains that now sit permanently at half-mast, porch lights that burn all night, a faded photograph tacked inside a church where prayers are left like quietly folded cloth. A friend who writes for a regional paper told me that small stories like these, tendered in the margins of copy,
tend to flatten into categories: missing, unexplained, ongoing.
But for people who held the phone while someone listened to a tapping wall, or who stood over a pack left by a gate, those categories are jagged and personal. Take Ava's place at the diner. On a slow morning months later, I watched her wipe the counter and set the napkin dispenser straight. The far left seat stayed empty most nights she worked there. When she heard the radio mention a man brought in on a welfare check 2 towns over, she looked up and never said his name. She just put coffee in the pot. People there have a language for keeping distance between the safe light and the rest of the road, manners that are both courtesy and armor. Some of these stories have small patches of resolution. A lost hiker might be found with a sprain or a tail that matches what was feared. A set of belongings might be identified by a tag, and a family might get the thin relief of proof. Other stories sink into the kind of absence that smells like old cloth and will not be folded away. Ghost files in the courthouse, missing persons cases that sit in drawers, and the slow accumulation of crosses and names. Those markers become more than memorials. They are community testimony against being forgotten. What made me return more than once was not the hunger for a scare, but the curiosity for ritual and reaction. How do people who live under a particular slope of night respond when the night turns hostile in a slow, almost polite way? They change small habits, the way they leave the porch light, the nicknames they use for children, the routes they teach teenagers to take to school. They write rules into the way they move. Don't stop at the gate after dark. Never let a stranger know your last name. Always check behind a parked car before you get in. Those rules keep the community alive in a way formal policing cannot. There is also the quieter cumulative effect, a kind of communal listening that sharpens like a blade. If you live where the hills keep count, you become attuned to low things, a footstep at the edge of light, the wrong echo of a radio, the rhythm of a tap that suddenly matches your pulse. People begin to compare notes at gas stations and at funerals, because those are the places where practical things are traded alongside condolences. It isn't melodrama, it is the practical partnership between memory and survival. At the same time, the stories make room for human darkness. The crosses by the creek, the hands described in news clippings, and the figure in a diner all carry with them the uncomfortable possibility that some dangers are human and ordinary. Folks in these valleys know strangers can be predators. They also know the land itself can be indifferent and strange. Both make a kind of terror that is slow and precise. I said at the beginning these are reported accounts, gathered from interviews, neighborly warnings, and clippings. It's important to say it again here because the line between rumor and record is often porous.
The sheriff's reports I was given were factual and spare. The people who told me these stories gave me texture, the things bureaucracy can't hold. The exact way a porch light tilted, the smell of wet tobacco on a shirt, the way a child's name sounded when called from a ridge. I treated each account with the care it deserved. Names were altered in some cases, locations generalized, and anything that might inflame a real investigation was handled with restraint. These are not horror fictions invented to startle you. They are the small, terrible things neighbors pass to one another in the way that keeps a community aware. There are also rituals of memory that feel like forms of resistance. In one valley, after a woman went missing whose car had last been seen leaving a diner at closing time, a group of local knitters started making reflective scarves, bright, reflective loops that drivers could wear and be seen with. They gave them out at church socials with the quiet seriousness of people who keep a town safe by slow, ordinary acts. In another place, after a boy vanished on a ridge and never returned, a weekly lantern walk began, people carrying light along the footpaths where authorities had searched and failed. If official inquiry falters, community care moves in with what it has: light, memory, record-keeping. Chloe's notebook of crosses is one of those repositories, names and dates listed like a secular litany, so the creek will not be a silent eraser. There are also stories that warn in a different key, less about monsters and more about the cost of naivete. Teenagers who look for the house that shouldn't be are folktale cautionary figures. Visiting strangers who sleep in their cars on a dark shoulder invite risk. People who do not heed simple hometown rules, tell your family where you go, come back by dusk, avoid the gate after dark, are more likely to become a line in a ledger someone else files. The land does not discriminate, it simply receives what is offered. Humans can be predators behind the curtain of hospitality. The mountains are indifferent. And yet, oddly, the landscape offers consolation too.
The same hollers that teach you vigilance also produce the language of comfort. A nightlight in the window, the smell of biscuits, a neighbor's truck at the end of the lane. Stories are not only warnings, they are guides for how to be careful without losing the capacity for kindness. People put up crosses not only to mark loss, but to make pathways of remembrance strong enough that someone might notice. That insistence on memory is a recurrent thread, refusal to let absence become a blank. Before we close, there are small follow-ups that matter because they preserve the human side of these accounts. Logan sometimes returns to the edge of town, he told me, to sit in a friend's truck and listen to the dark, not to test it, but to see if his chest still tightens. Sophie sends postcards with a single sentence in the margins. Quiet is different now.
Mason visits the tree where Ray's rifle was found at times when the light hits the bark just so, and he leaves a shiny new bullet casing tucked in a crook of roots, because rituals, even improvised ones, are ways of keeping someone present. Ava went back to wait tables, but not at night, and when asked, she tells customers with a soft voice to check the counters twice. Habit made holy. Chloe's notebook sits on a shelf at the community center now, a collection of names. Some say they put there because a place remembers better when people refuse to be silent. What unites these tales, whatever you make of them, is not a common supernatural mechanism so much as a shared shaping power of place. The mountains and hollows, the creeks and shelf roads form a geography that insists on response. People adapt. They alter their routes, their habits, their speech. They build shrines and adopt rituals. They teach children rules because some lessons survive better than others. If, after hearing these accounts, you feel a little raw at the edges, that's as it should be. These are not bedtime stories meant to be shaken off at dawn. They are accounts from people who still live with a mixture of fear and stubborn normalcy. They report grooves of sound in the mud, taps that tracked a heartbeat, rifles that were left standing upright, polite men whose acceptance into ordinary spaces revealed the thinness of our guard. Those things seep into you differently than a made-up scare. You carry them with you because they ask you to be attentive. One final image, then. Imagine yourself driving home on a road where the pavement fades and the trees leaning to read your license plate. You turn off the stereo because the noise is a buffer. You pass a porch light that stops the dark like a wall. Somewhere beyond it, someone could be walking a patient measure in the black. The hush feels like a person waiting for an answer it cannot quite name. The house may be empty. The name may be a lock. Whatever it is, it learns rhythms, listens for a pattern, and keeps them. Once you have heard these accounts, once the tapping or the pacing or the long call of a name rests under your ribs, you cannot unhear them. They slip into the places you thought were private and rearrange them. These stories were compiled from local reports, interviews with residents, and public records where they exist. In all cases, I have used care to alter particulars that might endanger privacy or interfere with ongoing inquiries. Many of the cases described remain open or unexplained. Others have small pieces of closure that came through community effort rather than official verdict. Respect for those affected is the guiding line through this work. If one of these tales stayed with you, if the idea of porch steps counting or taps answering your heartbeat or a name being called from the dark sits under your skin, tell us which one in the comments.
Like and subscribe if you want more documented Appalachian Backroads accounts. And if you live along these roads, tell someone where you're going and come back before the night learns your rhythm.